ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
How do you feel? Excited and nervous at the same time?
Births, deaths, marriages. There are big days in life you'll likely remember forever.
We were so shocked.
Not always for the right reasons.
People can be so uncaring in an industry which requires the utmost empathy.
When emotions run high, it's easy to drop your guard.
An ultimate act of betrayal.
Births, deaths and marriages on Background Briefing. Hear it now on the ABC Listen app.
It was a well-planned, perfectly executed and swift operation. Rebels in Syria brought down the brutal, murderous Assad regime, which had ruled for half a century, in just 8 days. But with the main rebel group behind it having previous links to al-Qaeda, what does the future hold? Today, Global Affairs editor John Lyons on what comes next and what it means for the Middle East. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
Rebel forces have retaken control of the city of Aleppo and dozens of towns in the country's northwest.
The surprise attack by the rebel coalition, led by the Islamist HTS, was met with almost no resistance.
The Syrian army has withdrawn from the city of Hama as rebel forces break through government defences.
We do know that there's very fierce fighting occurring in the strategically important city of Homs, north of Damascus.
The lightning offensive by jihadist rebels seized President Bashar al-Assad's seat of power, Damascus, just hours ago.
John, that moment when rebel fighters took over control of the Syrian capital, Damascus, the images, the emotion coming out of that area was incredible.
Well, Sam, the idea that we would see people in Damascus, the very heart of the Assad, the half-century-old Assad regime in Syria, the images of people tearing down a statue of Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, was something I didn't think I'd see.
Jubilation and celebration in the capital. Huge crowds gather as news of the regime's demise spreads.
The former residence of Bashar al-Assad has been raided, with people taking furniture and art from the luxury presidential palace.
Thousands waving and chanting as the rebels declare the city free of a tyrant.
Syria has always been one of the hardest, even in a very tough neighbourhood that the Middle East is. Syria's always been particularly hard, particularly brutal and ruthless against anybody who criticised or opposed the regime. So to see it in the space of 8 or 9 days fall is something historic.
And the current president, John, he took over in the year 2000, when his father died, and the atrocities under his rule have been horrifying.
When Bashar, his son, took over, there was a sense there, when I travelled to Syria under Bashar al-Assad, there was a sense that he's new, it's a new generation. His wife had been educated in the UK, in London. They were much more Western, and he was building universities. There was a sense of optimism that he wouldn't be as bad as his father. But then, of course, when there was an uprising against him in 2011, peaceful process to begin with, he began, of all of the Arab dictators, one of the most brutal responses, including, according to Amnesty International, dropping barrel bombs on his own people. Barrel bombs, as Amnesty defines them, are oil drums, fuel tanks or gas cylinders filled with explosives and metal fragments plunged from helicopters. Amnesty estimated that between 2012 and 2020 that the regime there killed more than 11,000 civilians in Syria. So much for Mr. Modern and Mr. Moderation.
Totally. And the estimate is around 500,000 people have died or disappeared did amid that civil war.
That's right.
So it's huge. I mean, the figure's massive.
Well, people thrown into prison, never heard of again. Their relatives thought they were dead.
It really is such a brutal regime that has now been overthrown, and the president is now hiding away, John, in Russia, right?
That's right. According to the Russian media, he's arrived in Russia. That was always a possibility. And Bashar al-Assad, obviously, when he saw that the rebels were literally marching towards Damascus, having conquered Aleppo, Hama, Homs, they were on a roll, these rebels, and he clearly decided that he didn't want to have his fate in their hands, went to the military airport there and as quickly as he could got a plane off to Russia.
Yeah, and asylum in Russia, because Russia and Iran have backed him across the years. So just explain that, and why didn't they come to his rescue this time?
The reason they didn't come to his rescue was they're so distracted that the Russians, of course, are completely focused now on the war in Ukraine. So with Donald Trump's election, and he's talked about resolving that Ukraine-Russia war within 24 hours or quickly, the Russians are now expecting that when Trump takes office on January 20, that there will be a forced negotiation between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and that Trump may well say, OK, the war's over, to the Ukrainians, who they have leverage over, the Americans, you keep what you have. And so the Russians are now trying to get back Kursk. And so that's the context in which Russia doesn't have any spare capability. So they were not there to help out. And I think the rebels sitting in Idlib watched all of this. Very, very smart calculation. This is one of the most spectacular military operations we've seen. In 8 days, you conquer one of the biggest and toughest regimes in the Arab world. And they were calculating, I think, that Iran's distracted with Israel. Israel has said, we're going to hit Iran again. Hezbollah is seriously wounded from its war with Israel, and Russia's completely distracted. So the three groups that could have come to the Assad regime's help were not there.
So now let's look then, John, at these groups that, as you say, have taken just 8 days to overthrow a regime that was in power for 50 years. The main group, of course, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. So tell me about that.
Well, let me read from an Australian government description of them. And it was based upon this description that the Australian government decided that they should be listed as a terrorist group. In September 2024, the Australian government described them saying Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, is a Sunni Islamist, religiously motivated, violent extremist group based in northwestern Syria. It says HTS opposes the government of Bashar al-Assad and aims to replace the government with an Islamic caliphate. HTS leaders have sought to transition the group from an insurgency to an organised paramilitary force and civilian authority in an attempt to gain domestic and international support for its objectives. That's the Australian government's assessment. And it's a good description. It's an offshoot originally of al-Qaeda and then Jabhat al-Nusra. It's come from those Sunni jihadist groups. But what they've tried to do in recent years is set themselves up as a much more moderate group, more inclusive. Their leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, he's 42, and he's got an eye on the Western media, and he's tried to paint himself as an inclusive leader who will not enforce a lot of the barbarity that groups like al-Qaeda have.
All right, so it's listed as a terrorist group, but it has broken ties, right, with al-Qaeda, and it's tried to regain this sort of international legitimacy. Are we certain that it doesn't want an Islamic State anymore?
Well, it's difficult to know that for sure. They're saying they don't, but that same Australian assessment says that based on all its information, and the Australian government would have got a lot of good intelligence information to make this conclusion, it says the Australian government assesses that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is directly or indirectly engaged in, preparing, planning, assisting in, or fostering the doing of terrorist acts. Now, there's some elements of the media are suggesting, oh, look, this is a good outcome, etc. But Even within the Sunni world in Syria, this group has enemies. So I can understand 100% why Syrians, many of them are celebrating the sense of relief at the end of a more than 50-year-old regime. But it's not clear exactly what all of these different groups will do, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
All right, well, its leader did give an exclusive interview to CNN. He spoke about plans to create a government based on institutions and a council chosen by the people.
Syria deserves a governing system that is institutional, not one where a single ruler makes arbitrary decisions.
So he's certainly saying the right things, John. He's not talking about an Islamic state.
Well, Sam, a council chosen by the people, but my question would be which people? We just don't know yet.
Yeah, sure. All right. And one of the first things this group has done was to release political prisoners. That was its biggest priority, really.
Well, that's right. On its march from Aleppo, Homs, Hama into Damascus, it was literally busting open the doors of a lot of the prisons. It's been estimated that as many as 100,000 people disappeared during the civil war, which began in 2011 in Syria. In fact, The Guardian had a fascinating sort of piece looking at the release of these prisoners and said that many of the prisoners released in the last couple of days emerged frail into the bright December sunlight, greeted by weeping family members who had no idea they were still alive.
Yes.
And they verified videos from Damascus which showed dozens of women and small children being held in cells and the rebels opening the doors and saying, "Don't be afraid."
John, let's look now at what comes next, because it's clearly a very dangerous, unstable time still. That was a point made by the US President Joe Biden.
We will remain vigilant. Make no mistake, some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses. And they're saying the right things now. But as they take on greater responsibility, we will assess not just their words, but their actions.
So what are we looking at?
Well, there are so many big power groups who have influence or want to have influence in Syria that what we see in the next few days and weeks will be the contest to see who can salvage whatever they had. The Russians, of course, have a major air force, air base and naval base in Syria. They are saying, the Russians, that we have an understanding with the new rebel government that those bases will be protected. Iran, of course, wants to have that influence, the Shia crescent of influence, Iran, Syria, Lebanon to Hezbollah. Now that the Sunni rebels have taken over, then Iran has a problem with that. The US and Israel, interestingly, they both wanted to see the end of the Assad regime. So bizarrely, Israel had the same aim as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, to see the end of Assad because Assad's close to Iran. However, now their interests probably diverge. The United States, Jake Sullivan said, "We won't cry for Assad, but we're also worried about what comes next." And so you've got all of these countries, the big winner being Turkey, which has a connection to this rebel group. Turkey has gained influence. All these big powers are going to try to be angling as to, can they have influence with the new regime coming into power.
Yeah, and by the way, Donald Trump, of course, will be the president next year, and he has said that America should stay well and truly out of it. It's not our fight, he says.
That's right. And the Biden administration talked about an historic opportunity for a better future. However, within 24 hours of the fall of the Assad regime, the US is reported to have made airstrikes on 76 different Islamic State sites in Syria. So things are already starting to hot up in this new post-Assad world. And so I think that we're going to see a new and an unpredictable world in the Middle East, which was already in crisis.
And now, John, for the Syrian people, I guess they just hope that things will become more stable.
It's been really tough for the Syrian people. I'm concerned, though, that it might end up a bit like Libya, where different groups are fighting amongst each other. There's no real government functioning in Libya, and it'll be fascinating to see whether, through all of this, Turkey and the big powers can try to shape some sort of credible, respectable government. Let's hope for the Syrian people, though, that it is stable and peaceful.
John Lyons is the ABC's Global Affairs Editor. This episode was produced by Cara Jensen McKinnon and Anna John. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.